We give a bit of a historical background of the decade itself, how it came about, and then also link it to what Brother Glenroy was just talking about, the issue of reparations and how the decade is significant to the issue of reparations, because indeed it is. So we are 2 years into the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, which was declared by the General Assembly in fall of 2014, that 2015 to 2024 was going to be the UN International Decade for People of African Descent. And the theme of the decade, as decided by the General Assembly, is recognition, justice, and development for people of African descent. And these three themes, or this theme, these three key words, essentially mean recognition for the particular situation facing people of African descent and the histories of people of African descent around the world that has led to this particular situation, and justice in the sense of equality before the law, but also justice in terms of rectifying injustices, and development in terms of developing developing policies, measures that would ensure that people of African descent enjoy equality of dignity and human rights. So this is the theme of the decade. Across the world to implement the decade primarily by developing a national action plan of policies for people of African descent to promote the human rights of people of African descent. So this is, in a nutshell, the decade, all right? And the reason for the decade, why the UN decided to have a decade, is that there are several reasons for that. But one, and the most important one, is that there is a recognition from the UN through its many monitoring mechanisms, such as the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, which has time and time again shown that throughout the world, people of African descent tend to belong to the most discriminated against, right? The groups that are most discriminated against. And as you may know, this is of course true of the UK too. It is true of Europe at large. And so, for instance, in the UK, we recently had a report, a race report, published by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is the National Human Rights Institute of the UK. And this report very clearly showed that people of African people in general in the UK suffer the most, more than any other ethnic, racial, or religious group, suffer the most from discrimination and various forms of social inequities, right? And this is also true across Europe, as was shown in 2008, for instance, by the so far most comprehensive minority discrimination survey ever to have been carried out in Europe. It was carried out by the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, with approximately 30,000 people across Europe being interviewed. And the name of this report is the European Union Minority and Discrimination Survey, published in 2008. And it clearly showed that in Europe, the two most discriminated against groups tend to be African people and Roma. Now, Roma. And if you go to so-called European settler states, such as all the countries across the Americas, right, or Australia, New Zealand, for instance, what you would find is that the two most discriminated against groups is indigenous people and people of African descent. So indigenous people are also very highly subjected to discrimination and marginalization and so forth, right? For very similar historical reasons. Now, indigenous people, before this decade for people of African descent, indigenous people had 2 decades, 2 UN decades. All right? And indigenous people before there was, which today there exists, a UN working group of experts on people of African descent. Before this group was established in 2002, or if it was 3, I think it's 2002, as a consequence of the Durban Conference Against Racism. But already back in 1982 or 83, there was a similar UN working group of experts on indigenous people that was established. And I think the 1980s was also one of the UN decades for indigenous people. And these 2 decades for indigenous people have, among other things, led to a UN declaration on the rights of indigenous people and also a UN permanent forum on indigenous issues. So I believe it is biannually at the UN headquarters in New York. There is a large international conference hosted by this UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where indigenous activists from around the world are able to come to the UN headquarters and express their grievances, right, to the UN Permanent Forum, which in turn then has the mandate to forward these grievances to the General Assembly and to member states and to speak on the behalf of indigenous people at the UN level, right? Now, what many of us are hoping, and what the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent is hoping too, is that one of the outcomes of African people, I hope it's going to be African people and not people of African descent, and also a UN permanent forum for African people. All right? And so now let me say a few words then about the history, because this ties into the history, right? The UN Decade for People of African Descent is in part rooted in the fact that there were already 2 decades for indigenous people. I think I believe the second decade ended sometimes in the 2000s, but anyway, so there had been at least 1 decade prior to the Durban Conference, and at the Durban conference, as Glenroy has mentioned, the Durban conference, African people played a very prominent role at the Durban conference, right? And one of the issues that was put high up on the agenda at the Durban conference was the issue of reparations for African people for histories of enslavement and colonialism and even an apartheid and genocide. All right? And a lot of African activists from around the world was pushing for this, and African states were also pushing to put reparations on the agenda in Durban. Now, Durban was both a success and a failure, or some feel a disappointment, maybe rather, when it comes to the issue of reparations. And it was a success in the sense that for the first time in a universal human rights instrument, the history of the transatlantic enslavement was defined as a crime against humanity. All right? And so that was a great achievement. So what was defined as a crime against humanity in Durban was enslavement, it was genocide, and apartheid too. Now, so that was a victory. What was also a victory was that in no uncertain terms, colonialism, European colonialism, and Europe's involvement in the transatlantic enslavement is the largest culprit of the racial discrimination, most of the racial discrimination that we see in the world today. So there was an acknowledgement in Durban that racism is largely a product of European colonialism, generally speaking, including the enslavement, very importantly, the enslavement of Africans. But, of course, so much else, right? The domination of other people, the domination of people and their resources and their lands, and all sorts of laws and all sorts of political systems that were put in place, international relations, relations of trade, all sorts of cultural phenomena, science, how history was understood and taught, and so forth. All this was part and parcel of European colonialism and led to a world of great racial inequities that we are still struggling with today. Right? This was recognized in Durban and is recognized by the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. This was a victory. Now, there were also some disappointments. And among the disappointments was that although enslavement was defined as a crime against humanity, the British government actually managed to put in a little caveat into the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. And this caveat said that although that enslavement is a crime against humanity and should always have been so, meaning that at the time that the enslavement took place it was not a crime against humanity according to British law or international law. And why they wanted to put that in there, of course, is to make it much harder to persecute Britain and other states for these historical crimes against humanity. Now, one of the outcomes of Durban, one of the many outcomes of Durban, was that one of the articles of Durban called for the establishment of a UN working group of experts on people of African descent. And this led to the actual establishment of such a working group in 2002, I believe it was. And this working group still exists. And it is mainly thanks to the efforts of this working group, together with civil society organizations and activists, that has made this decade a reality. It was the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent that first drafted the program for the decade, which was highly revised, from what I've understood, before it was accepted by the General Assembly. But it is still a very progressive, I would say, or not very, but it is a progressive program. And if this program was properly recognized and implemented in the UK, it would by far be the most progressive thing that has ever happened to Africans in this country. All right? But as you may know, the British government has declared that it has no specific plans to mark the decade, right? And so the government has taken no steps to launch the decade, taken no steps to implement its program of activities, taken no steps to develop a national action plan for the recognition, justice, and development for African people in this country. And so to put pressure on government to properly recognize and implement the decade, a group of us have decided to develop, and we have already developed, a coalition, a civil society coalition of African-led organizations and prominent individual activists for us to come together and work together to put pressure on the government and parliament to properly recognize and implement the decade. That is how the International Decade for People of African Descent Coalition UK was founded. We are having a constitutional meeting to solidify this coalition as an organization this upcoming Saturday, December 3rd, at the RMT headquarters between Euston and King's Cross in the city of London. I would think there should be enough seats for people that are interested to come and join this meeting and witness what we are hoping is going to be, hopefully, a historical meeting. There's a lot more to be said, but I think maybe I'll just end here, and then we can, I can maybe, if you have questions, I can elaborate on things, and let's have a dialogue, and
I think we can't misunderstand the intention or perhaps the development of the march. I don't think people should see the march as an act in itself. Yeah, we're not going to march to Parliament and get reparation when we get to the end. That's not what that is about. I think this is a reminder of the existence of our struggle around reparation. As I said, I wasn't at the evaluation meeting, but I recall the first move to have the march, because I think originally, I think somebody was saying July or trying to do it at short notice, but it has evolved that it waited until the 1st of August, an appropriate day, and was used in that way. Since then, there's obviously been fragmentation about who is organising the march, and I think most people, if not everybody, is aware of that. So that's an issue. But I think that the march must be maintained. Yes. And perhaps I approach it from a trade union point of view. I'm a trade unionist on the underground. We have May Day March every year. And we, the London committee has said that we will have it the 1st of May, whenever the 1st of May is. You know, whether it's a Sunday or whether it's a Wednesday or whatever. The date is important. And I think that's what I would want from the march. Not that somehow it will be that process that will get us that issue. We talked about the lobby of Parliament. One of the things about the 1st of August is obviously it's when Parliament is closed. Yeah. So it isn't, I don't think, to some degree, impact on Parliament. So we need things in between that relates and could accumulate down to the 1st of August. So those are things that I'll work on and develop. Some people might say, well, you know, it's been 3 years, you know, maybe we should have been further along with what organisation. I'm not going to make excuse for anyone. I'm not in that core organisation group. But I know that their aspiration is to have the annual march, and it's an aspiration I support. I think that it cannot stand on its own. It must engage the March Committee. The energy that brings up must be utilised to engage during the other times of the year. But let's keep it in context. I don't think the first march was ever thinking that we would get to Parliament and they would surrender. And I don't think the second one or the third one does, and I don't think the fourth one will be to that objective. The idea is to remind Africans in the UK and globally that the demand for reparation is still on the agenda, wherever we find ourselves on the 1st of August.
Michael, do you want to add to it?
Yeah. So, yes, you know, I think this point about marching, that you raised, is a very important one, because there's, unfortunately, I think, the strategy of massive public manifestations such as marches, or taking to the streets, maybe not as in the form of a march, but in other forms, right? There's too many people, and this is not particular to any community. I just think this is just generally speaking, right? And even if you look at climate activists, I see the same, I would say, problem. And that is a belief that I think all too many seem to have. And that is that if we can just mobilize enough people, get out on the streets and be loud enough, and make enough noise, get enough public attention, somehow this by itself is going to lead to some sort of revolution, or is going to lead to some sort of political change. But if you study how many of these marches has led to any sort of political change whatsoever, whatsoever. And even, I have a lot of respect for the Black Lives Matters movement. I think it's fantastic. It's one of the greatest things social movements for decades. But even the Black Lives Matter movement, with its massive mobilization of people and massive public manifestations that have had massive international attention, how much concrete political change do you think it has led to? And so I think we need to rethink and reevaluate our strategies when it comes to trying to create change, real change, right? And have real impact. And I think many of us need to give up our romanticizing revolutionary fantasies about marches and public manifestations and so forth. And we need to take a sober look at what the significance, if any, the political significance of marches is. I think Brother Glenroy put his finger on, the significance of the August First Day March, for instance, I can't remember the word you used, but to raise public awareness on the issue and to show people that it is still on the agenda, right? So marches can fill an important function in raising public awareness around an issue, right? But just raising public awareness around an issue, there's a long step from that to actually affecting any sort of political change. Mm-hmm. And so if we want to affect political change, because we all recognize that unless there's some sort of revolution, right? And I would be the first one to join that revolution if anyone has any sort of concrete, feasible steps how to just overthrow the system, all right? Mm-hmm. But unless we can overthrow the system, right? And that is not going to happen anytime soon. Then the question is, how can we have the system work for us, and how can we make the system bring about policies that would change our situation, right? And we all recognize it's only through political decision making, through policies, also maybe decision making in major organizations such as maybe major international trade organizations and so forth, that is capable of bringing about the sort of structural changes that we need and desire. All right? And so are we able to effect such political changes? I think it has to be a combination of various strategies, and among them is lobbying. Lobbying is a highly underestimated political strategy. Now, we talked about the Holocaust and the Jews and so forth. Do you think that the Jews, which have an enormous political influence, is it through hitting the streets? It is through lobbying. They have an enormous political influence only through lobbying. Now, if you look at the United States, for instance, and the United States is a special case maybe, but not all that special, because it's not all that different from how politics works in Europe. Is something like 89% of all the political decisions made in the American Congress is a direct result of lobbying. Where does that leave democracy and the public? All right? So it is through establishing personal contacts with policymakers and putting direct pressure through direct personal contacts with policymakers. That is a very important strategy that we cannot and should not underappreciate. So, and I think if you look at the civil rights movement and its victories in the States, which was probably which was for African Americans, the most successful movement was the movement that was led by King in terms of policies and policy changes and so forth, and the Civil Rights Acts and so forth. What made it so successful? It was a combination of both raising public awareness through all these public manifestations, sit-ins, demonstrations, bus boycotts, and so forth, but also through lobbying. King and others had direct contact with the president himself and various policymakers. So I think we need to seriously rethink our strategies.
Okay, thank you. Yes, there's a comment or question. Michael, please go ahead. Mikey.
Well, it's a small comment and then a question to Michael. Basically, in terms of the August the 1st march, we could probably be a little bit more imaginative around it. I think, what we see from May Day, industrial action is effective, or industrial inaction. August the 1st, August the 22nd, August the 23rd are fantastic days, because if we say we all down tools, it doesn't mean that our students don't work. Our students are on recess anyway, so therefore every other person of our heritage within this country can be made to down tools eventually, because I think eventually we can embarrass the rest of them not to do it, because a lot of us will do it and some won't. Some will still drive the bus and some will still be seen going about because they say they need, etc., etc. But eventually we can embarrass everyone, and if we down tools, everybody of our heritage down tools, we bring the country to a standstill. We bring it a little bit closer. In terms of, I know you cannot speak for the coalition, but I didn't know if it would be an intention of the coalition to somehow engage the AU. I don't know what your views are on how effective that organization is. I don't know if you think that there may be some way in which you can maybe elevate their effectiveness, but I don't know if that is something that you would consider. Especially, we have 8 years now. We've already lost 2 years. We have 8 years in which to make a difference. The world can change every 7 years. Every time there's something that happens in one country, the world changes. We can change the world within this next 8 years, but how is there a great enough will amongst the people who we may ask to speak on our behalf?
Yeah, that's a very good and very important question, and I think that is one of the strategies that should be explored, is to try to establish collaborations with the African Union and with African states. This is actually something that a group that I am part of is we're trying to work for a UN conference on reparations, and we're trying to make the African Union interested in this and African states, and hopefully host the conference in Ghana is one of the places actually, and this is something that I actually would like to speak with the three of you about one day, because I know you have a lot of contacts and a legendary father. Yes, legendary. Yes. So yes, engage in the African Union. And Gus John, which is one of the people that is very much involved in the coalition, he is very much involved in the African Union 6-region initiative, right? And that is that the African diaspora is to become the 6th region of the African Union. But no, so far, I think from what I understand, there has not been taken any concrete steps to formalize this in terms of setting up a system that would allow Africans in the diaspora to have an influence on the Pan-African Parliament in Addis Ababa. But working with the African Union around this, linking the 6th region to the decade and so forth, and the importance of the diaspora collaborating with the with the African Union, and that the diaspora, as much as the African Union, have so much in common in terms of what we are essentially, our greatest obstacle is the history and continuing legacies of colonialism, and in particular, of course, the transatlantic enslavement. All right, and this is something that we share with the continent and the African Union, and it should be possible for us to collaborate around this, to bring greater attention within the UN, for instance.
Stalemate about a top-down we'll empower you, rather than the people in the 6 regions saying we are now part of the African Union. Yeah, it doesn't require some sort of ceremonial issue. We've always felt that we were that was our own, so we should act accordingly. You know, and lots of places around the continent, I'm sure there are people who feel disempowered. So I think that the question is right: what is the African Union doing? But it also should include what are we doing as part of the 6th region, and it's something that we should get to grips with.
Excuse, could you just continue with that, Brother Glenroy? Would it be part of the GAC's role to maybe mobilise different pockets of the diaspora in that we could put our case? You know, because you said you were looking to set up branches even within India.
Yeah.
And many regions where we exist,
Yeah.
and our presence is not necessarily acknowledged, or a lot of people are not even aware of us, but much less the places where we know that we are.
Yeah. The reality is India, the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, these are the 6th region. So our structure, our organization in those regions is part of that attempt to structuralize the 6th region. Yeah. But the point I'm saying is that people are looking at some finite point later on. But we're citizen of the 6th region now, not when there is some sort of formal approach. So we should start acting accordingly. You know, we need to make more demand. You know, I want to, if I turn up at some airport on the continent, where are you from? Well, I'm from the 6th region. Yeah, what is your nationality? I'm an African from the 6th region. Those are some of the things that we need to be very forceful about. You know, it will take time. I mean, I understand. I seem to have gone quiet about the African passport. Well, you know, where's ours? You know, if we're part of that process, and is our diplomats? If it's going to start with diplomat, I don't have a problem with that. You know, it seems a bit silly, but if you're going to start with diplomat, well, are those people getting an African passport? Xtra is our representative on the 6th region. Is he going to get one? You know, what are the dynamics there? And we should all be demanding that. Let's speed that up. But I don't believe that we should sit by and wait, because it's been problematic. We've been talking about this for so long, and it's been in place. I've been part of structures here where we try to mobilise in the UK to be part of that. I'm aware of effort they made in the US.